So I got a power steering leak. In fact, you can see the red fluid right there. And what it does is it runs down behind the compressor and it drips off with everything down there. You see a drop at the bottom of the compressor and then red fluid on the ground, not a good sign. Anyway, so I think that leaks, and I may have a little bit of a leak at the bottom of the compressor. I have a gasket for that, but I've never taken this power steering pump apart, and I don't know if I can get one, although I do see some markings on it, so maybe I can get a number. I know it's a Vickers pump, and it's not in the manual. It's not in the manual or the parts book, and so I'm going to have to feel my way through this one. I hate taking it off of there, but I don't think I have much choice, so we'll see where this goes from here. Alright, so step one was to remove the supply hose that went from the reservoir over to the pump. And you can see the hose is out. It's down here on the floor. We're going to get another one because they're kind of rotten. They've been on there for probably 50 years. And when we did that, we drained this, had a bucket here, we drained that, and we took the other hose off, which was the return line. That comes back from the power steering unit in the front, and took them both off and drained the reservoir completely, or as completely as we could. It's still weeping a little bit, so we put caps on it. And then the next step will be actually to remove this air sep system, which isn't on most buses. This is an add-on to pick up the oil droppings and the breather tube droppings, so that you got no oil on the floor on the back of the bus when you're operating. So anyway, that'll be the next step. So we remove the air sep canister, and that gives us much greater access to the power steering pump. And you can see that the output line, the supply line, goes through this filter, which is another filter that you can take off, and it comes apart. I'll show you because I'll do that in a minute. Well, I'll do that at some point here. And anyway, so we'll replace that line too. And it appears that it's leaking on the top here. And get a better light here so you can see what's leaking. There's a little dowel pin that goes through there and holds a cap on it. It must have a spring in there or something that causes that to leak. Anyway, so maybe we can fix that without having to replace the whole pump. So here's how that filter comes off. You unscrew the base on that, and then it just sort of slides off like that. And that's what it looks like. So you just dip it in cleaning solvent, and then you blow it out with an air gun a few times. Dip it a couple of times, and blow it out a couple of times, and put it back together, and that's all there is to it. Pretty simple. Old school technology. Everything's paper these days. So we took off the filter canister, which is now on here and repainted, and we cleaned the filter element by spreading it apart and letting it's hundreds of little metal sheets that form together to make the filter. When you compress it by turning the screw up at the bottom, it closes in on those sheets, and they have different thicknesses to them, and the thickness is whatever the number of microns of passage it allows particles to go through. So we filled it up with fluid after we painted and cleaned it up, put everything back together, and then we just simply screw this thing on to the bottom of the canister bracket right there. So that's all there is to the filter on this end. Now there's another filter that's inside of the reservoir, and we'll have to take the reservoir off to get it out, and we'll get that off and then clean it, or not clean it, it's a paper filter, and replace it. So there are two filters in the power steering system, this one and that one. So I just wanted to show you that I had removed the canister, the power steering fluid reservoir, because it also has a filter in it. So you just basically unscrew the top and There's inside a gasket on the top, a spring, a basket to catch anything large that might fall in there that has a fine screen in it. And then on top of that is one more filter. So there are two filters for the power steering system. This one, the primary filter, and then there's a secondary filter that has a much finer micron rating than this does and keeps things from going into the system after it comes through the pump. So if you're going to do the whole service job, you have to do both of these things. And one more thing, the box comes with the rubber gasket for the top. Get a new one of those, and it is Wix part number 51487. So it's a Wix filter. Other people make the filter, but I don't know what those numbers are. I always use Wix, and that's the new one and how it comes. So to bring you up to date, I said earlier that I'd gotten ahead of myself, and I thought that I could take this housing unit off of the main gear housing for the backside of the engine and break it off here and then take the pump off, because as I said before, when you take the two bolts out that hold the pump onto the housing, you know, your inclination would be that it would just slide out, but there's a cone-shaped device in there that wedges into the drive from the blower that has a bigger diameter on it than the housing hole is, which I don't know why they'd make that like that. So in effect, what you have to do is you have to take off the generator, and when you look in this bus to see how hard that is to take off, you have to take all of this stuff out of the way to do that. And I really didn't want to do that. So I broke the seal on this housing mount right here between the pump and the housing mount, and I put it back on. It didn't have any breaks in it, just came off clean. So I put it back on. I'm hoping for the best that that's not going to leak. And anyway, so I put it back together. We got, you know, all new lines, because my lines have been on there for 30 some years that I've owned the bus, and I think they'd been on there for 20 years before that, or maybe they're original, because they were steel braided lines on the inside, and they were pretty nice lines. But anyway, so we got all new lines. We cleaned out this little filter here that you take apart and clean. We took the canister off and cleaned the filter that was in there. I showed you that. We've got everything pretty much back together. I don't have the whole AirSep system, this AirSep system back together. But what I really did, that I want to show you, was I discovered that it was leaking through this valve. And what this is, there's a pin here, a retention pin, that you drive out with a punch. And then I made the stupid mistake of it didn't come right out, so I let it go for a second. I went to get a different tool, and while I was getting a different tool, the thing flew out of there. It took me about 3 hours to find the valve. It was buried down there on top of the transmission someplace. Anyway, so it's pretty simple. It's a valve that has a spring in the bottom of it, and then this plate on the top is just a cover with an O-ring in it. And I believe what the problem was, while I was getting all this red fluid in there, was the O-ring for this retention plate had simply gotten old and hard, and so oil was seeping out through that, because everything up here was wet with oil, and there was a puddle of oil, you know, red fluid underneath. Initially, I thought that I didn't have the book. It turns out that this pump and this setup is contained in the supplemental book, which actually the 4106s transferred in their production line somewhere for the 4 years that they made them between 1961 and 65. They transferred the plan to this plan, and the original ones, like mine, which was the original one, had the reservoir up here, but mine didn't have that when I bought the bus. It was always set up like this. So when I first got started with this job, my plan was to just take these two bolts off, the bolt here and the bolt here, that attached the pump to the housing, okay? And that was what I was going to do, and then do whatever I had to do to the pump, thinking that it was leaking somewhere. When I took everything off to try to get access to that, I realized that the pump was just leaking up here at the top, where the cover is for the relief valve. Anyway, so I started off by taking off the fuel filters and then the fuel filter bracket. And the fuel filter bracket has 2 bolts that go all the way through this gear housing. This is the flywheel and gear housing for the drive units that go to the power steering pump, the air compressor, and the generator. And it also has the tooth ring on there for the starter, which is on the other side. Anyhow, so I started off by taking these 2 bolts off right here and right here that go all the way through, taking off the filters, and then I was going to remove the housing. When I got these off and I was able to see in there, I realized that the housing that this is part of actually is also the housing for the mounting for the generator, well, or the alternator. And that was a problem because I didn't want to take off the alternator. It was too much work. And I'd already taken this apart right here, separating the pump from the housing. So now I was in a dilemma because there's a cone-shaped attachment on the end of the shaft for the pump that's bolted on there. It's got a nut on the end of it, and that fits into the drive unit on the back of the blower. And so the problem is that you can't take that cone through the housing without taking the whole housing off and then disconnecting it, loosening the bolt and taking the housing off and then sliding the pump off. So that's a real pain in the neck. And if somebody knows that I'm wrong about that, please write in the comments and let me know, because that was what I discovered when I went to take this thing apart. So at any rate, my plan was foiled. I've taken all this stuff off, taken the pump separated from the housing, and I wasn't able to get them apart. It turns out, even though the book says you can't service any of this pump on the bus, turns out that you actually can service this relief valve O-ring without taking it off. So when I got all this other stuff off of here, I was able to see that, and then I was able to just put a new O-ring in here that allowed me to fix the leak. So mine was leaking, as I said, through this little plate up here, and there's a picture of it in the video somewhere else. And all there is in here is a little plate on the top. It looks like about a dime-sized thing that has an O-ring in it and has a little finger on the bottom of it that depresses the relief valve in there that goes in, and then there's a spring at the bottom of it that holds the relief valve up against the plate. And it's really pretty simple. The only thing you have to be careful about is that when you take it apart, you don't let it fly apart like I did, and then you have to hunt the valve down back there somewhere forever to try to find it. So it's very simple to fix that part if that's what's leaking on your pump. One more thing I should say about this pump is that, the manual says that you can't do any servicing on this pump while it's on the coach. But there are, in my opinion, a couple things that you could do, and I studied the book pretty carefully about this. One is you could take these 3 bolts off for this head on this thing if this gasket around here begins to leak, and you could change that gasket without taking it off. Obviously, the second one was you can change that O-ring in this plug on top of the relief valve without taking the pump off. And the third thing that you could service on here, I believe, without taking this pump off, is that you can take off the 4 bolts that are on this side of the pump, and that separates the pump body from the base of the pump, which is right here. I don't know if you can see this crack. There's a crack that goes all the way around here, and there's a small O-ring at the top that allows the fluid to flow through from this side to this side of the pump, and there's the main pump housing, or the main pump body, I guess, inside the housing that spins around, that is also separated, or is also sealed off rather, between this side of the pump and this side of the pump with an O-ring. So there's an O-ring about 2 inches in diameter here. There's another one that's about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. And I think if you were really careful and you had a leak that was coming out between the pump, halfway on this crack where it's bolted together, that you could most likely service those 2 O-rings if you have fluid escaping from there. So beyond that, though, if you needed to service the bearings, or somehow the shaft got messed up or something like that, you would have to take the whole pump off. But I think that you can slide all this stuff off the end of the shaft in the back of the body here without taking the pump off the coach, which will save you a heck of a lot of work and not having to take that alternator off of the bus. So just some points. I haven't done it, so I can't say firsthand, but from looking at the book, I think you can.